John chapter 18, verses 1 to 40. So if you have your Bibles open, you can read along, or it'll be up on the screen. So John chapter 18, starting from verse 1. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen, said to him, he went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave to me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because the disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants' officials stood around a fire, and they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you should answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there, warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the place of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out and asked them, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, My servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising.
Hey everyone, it's great to... probably turn this on. Can you hear me? Yep. It's great to be with you. I don't have any slides for this afternoon, so I'm hoping that what you might do is pull out a Bible or a device and follow along carefully. If you don't have a Bible or device, just ask someone next to you. I'm sure they would be more than willing to allow you to look on. From all the way back in chapter 2, Jesus has been talking about the hour or his time that was coming. Some future time that would capture the essence of his mission on earth. And the whole story really has been building up to this hour. Because in chapter 12, halfway through the gospel, some Greeks want to see Jesus. And that is the signal for Jesus that his time has finally arrived. Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." The hour to which he had come to be glorified. It was the hour in which he would be, he puts it in another place, lifted up. According to John 7, his brothers wanted him to go and reveal himself to the world. Show yourself, do something spectacular so the whole world will know who you are. And he says to them, "My time has not yet come." But now the time, the moment has arrived to which he was to draw the whole world to himself and do something that would draw everyone to himself. But no one ever imagined the events that were about to unfold, that would be what it was all about. Because after all, Jesus all the way through the gospel has been claiming to be the divine Son of God, that he claimed to be the promised king that would come to defeat the enemies of God and set up a perfect kingdom that would conquer the whole world and where he would rule over it forevermore in peace and harmony. And he backed that up, this extraordinary claim that he made, with some amazing miracles. He had unimaginable power to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to control nature, to walk on water. Amazing power. And so people assumed that the climactic event would be this dazzling display of power that would see him conquer and rule. I mean, after all, how else would you use that kind of power? But instead, from chapter 12, Jesus starts to talk very seriously to his disciples and to all around him that he was about to die, that he would be taken captive, that he would be beaten, suffer, and be crucified. But for Jesus, this is clearly his hour, his time, his climactic moment that would capture the essence of his mission on earth. I don't know if you realise, but each of the Gospels that tell this story of Jesus spend at least a quarter to a third, and in John's case, up to half of the Gospel leading up to the final day of his crucifixion. We know from John's Gospel, actually, there are 3 Passovers, and that's what gives us the idea that it was at least 3 years, his ministry on earth. It could have been longer, it could have been, it could be shorter, it could have been a little bit longer, but it's amazing, isn't it, that the whole Gospels tend to dedicate and focus their attention, even though he did all these extraordinary miracles and events happen around him, they focus in on his final week. In John 12, it is the final week, the final 5 days he's on earth. And half of the gospel is dedicated to that final 5 days. In fact, from chapter 13, just under half of the gospel, it's the final 24 hours while he's on earth. John clearly thinks that this event really is the essence. This is what it's all about. And so it's really good for us to be spending time in this part of the Bible, particularly leading up to the Easter event, which Christians all over the world tend to celebrate, because they recognise it too as the very heart of what Jesus was on about. This really is kind of holy ground that we're walking on. So it's good for us to focus on these chapters. Well, in the previous chapter, Jesus had been trying to reassure his close followers that what was about to happen to him would be no accident, but was totally according to plan. What he was doing was he was about saving them and protecting them. On the surface level, in chapter 18, it would have looked like to the disciples that he was being controlled by others as he's bound, dragged away, and then questioned by the various authorities and eventually condemned to death by Pontius Pilate. But throughout the story, John gives us very clear indications that it's in fact Jesus calling the shots. It's his plan that is unfolding. Or very specifically, it's his Father's master plan that he is actually carrying out. He will drink the cup, as he puts it, that his Father has given him to drink. And so right from the outset, we see Jesus leading the way. He leads the way to the garden. That's across the Kidron Valley where they regularly went. And we're told that Judas, the disciple who betrays Jesus, remember he left just a few hours before to go to the chief priests to tell them all about Jesus, to betray him. Because just remember, the Jewish leaders had been looking for an opportunity to arrest Jesus and have him killed, but they couldn't find that opportunity because Jesus was always teaching in public areas and the crowd liked Jesus and his teaching, and they were afraid to just go in the middle of him and rip him out. But Judas provides a wonderful opportunity for them because it's under the cover of night, away from the limelight, away from the crowds, and so he knows where he is and he leads them out there so that the soldiers and the officials can arrest him and take him to the Jewish leaders. Now, they're in a garden and it's dark, so it's easy for Jesus to slip away. Notice verse 4 tells us that Jesus knew all that was about to happen. But instead of slipping away, like he has virtually every other time when they've come to arrest him, he doesn't. He goes straight out to them and he asks them, who is it you want? And an amazing thing happens. They say, we're seeking Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, I am he. And they immediately draw back and fall to the ground. Now, what's happening there? I mean, are they just shocked that he would be one presenting himself? Well, no. For us who know a little bit more about the story, we recognise what Jesus is saying here, because he's been claiming to be this divine figure. And in fact, in John chapter 8, he has been claiming to be the I am. And that's what I am he actually says. It says I am, just in the original, I am. It is a way of saying I am he, but if we're in the know, and because of the reaction that we see, it clearly is a reference to his claim to be divine. Because all the way back in Exodus 3, when Moses asked God, who are you? What's your name? Who shall I tell the people who sent me? And God says to him, I am who I am. Go back to the people and say, I am sent me. And so he does. And so we know that this is the divine name. And Jesus is picking up on this. And what we see in the reaction of the soldiers and the officials is clearly a response to Jesus' claim to be divine, because that's what often happens when people come in the presence of divinity. They fall down. They can't stand. And all of this is to show us that Jesus clearly is in control of the moment. And he's making sure that everything now is going according to plan. He's clearly taking control. Even in verse 10, when Peter tries to put up a fight by pulling out his sword and swinging and cutting off the servant's ear. And when I was a kid, I thought, gee, that's pretty accurate swordmanship that Peter's, and let me show you how I can cut off the other one, but just watch out. No, actually, it's Peter taking a wild swing. He's point blank and he can't even kill him. That's how bad a swordsman he is. And it just results in chaos. And Jesus steps into the chaos and restores order. In another gospel, we know he heals this servant's ear. But Jesus says to Peter, "Put away your sword. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" It's all about the Father's master's plan. He will make sure. He'll drink the cup to ensure it happens. And even in this section, we can see that Jesus' death, this short introduction to the whole trial, that Jesus' death is not accidental, but planned out. It was deliberate. It was scripted by God the Father, by Jesus himself, as he tells us that his words are being fulfilled as well. His death was the mission that was given to him by his Father, and he would make sure that it's going to be carried out. Why? Because he trusts his Father, and he loves his Father, and he will do whatever his Father tells him to do. And secondly, well, we can see from the way that his death ensures that it was a sacrificial death to save others. He's determined, he says, to protect his disciples so that not one of them are lost. He doesn't die here, clearly, as a hapless victim, a victim of circumstance or whatever it was. He was not overcome by the authorities as he's trying to reform a system, a political system. No, he's not the one being controlled, but he is, in fact, very much the one in control in all of these circumstances. Now, what's significant as we turn our attention now to the actual trial as Jesus is led away in the rest of the story, that although Jesus is technically the one who is being tried and questioned and interrogated, Jesus throughout it starts asking questions, and questions are being asked of others. So in the end you're going, who is judging who? Because as Jesus is being tried, he seems to put others on trial. As the spotlight seems to come down on Jesus, he seems to turn the spotlight back onto his interrogators, onto the people around him. And that's a word of warning for you, friends, because everyone comes along, and when we hear the story of Jesus, we too have to make a decision about who he is and whether we will accept him as someone who is true and from God. And you need to realise that as you put Jesus under the spotlight, that in fact you are being put under the spotlight by him. That your heart is being exposed in the whole process. Because ultimately, it's not we who judge Jesus, but he is the one who will judge us. So just be aware. Well, let's look at the story a little bit more closely. Firstly, Jesus, we're told, is led away to Annas, the high priest. We're told here by John, who seems to be in the know, that Annas is actually the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was technically the high priest. Annas was installed by the Romans, who came in and deposed Caiaphas. And so they had to switch places. But Jewish law said the high priesthood role was for life. And they didn't like the Romans meddling into their religious affairs. And so they never really accepted that Annas was the high priest and kept on accepting that it should be Caiaphas. Or is that the other way around? I've got myself mixed up. But anyway, but in verse 14, we're told that Caiaphas, who was the one who had told the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. And John tells us this all the way back in chapter 11. So he wants us to go back and remember what he said, or what this high priest said all the way back in chapter 11, because it gives us an insight into what this whole trial is about for the Jewish leaders. So let's all go all the way back to chapter 11 and read from verse 47. And you'll notice that if you look at the beginning of chapter 11, the big event that has taken place... Can someone shut the doors? Is that all right? The big event that's taken place is the resurrection of Lazarus. Lazarus has been dead and buried for 4 days. Remember that famous line, by now he stinketh. But Jesus just shouts out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth, and the dead man comes out. And it's such an amazing miracle that everyone starts talking about Jesus. And look at the reaction of the Jewish leadership in verse 47. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is this man performing many signs. We let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And here, notice the consequence. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. And then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it's better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. And he didn't say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. And not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. And so from that day on, they plotted to take his life. And it's such an irony, isn't it, this unfolding events, because their plan is to kill Jesus, notice, to save their temple and their nation. It's better this way. And John is reminding us here, if we move forward to chapter 18, that this is why Jesus is on trial and why they are determined to have him executed. They thought it was better that Jesus die than the Romans come in, destroy their temple and destroy their nation. And ironically, what they're using here is the language of sacrifice, that one die for the many. They're sacrificing Jesus, though, for political, for religious, for national benefit, not the way that God intended the sacrifice to be done. So in their mind, rubbing Jesus out is better than having the nation rubbed out itself. Killing Jesus, in other words, is the lesser evil. But John tells us that actually this high priest was speaking truer words than he even realised, that he was actually speaking on behalf of God, that it is better that one man die for the people, and not just the Jews, but for all the people of the world, the scattered children of God. Not to save the temple or the nation from the judgment of the Romans, but to save the people from the judgment of God. Jesus was, in fact, dying as a sacrifice. But before we go on to the trial, we turn to Peter. John wants us to look at his good friend Peter, who is outside in the courtyard. Remember, Peter, only an hour or so before, had bravely told Jesus that he would be the one willing to die for him. It turns around, it flips on its head, really. But Jesus said to Peter that, in fact, you wouldn't be willing to die, that you'll be the one who will deny me, not just once, twice, but three strikes you're out, Peter. 3 times you're going to deny me. And I don't think that's all talk for Peter. I think he really had in mind to die for Jesus, because that's why he picks up the sword when the mob attacks him. There are Roman soldiers there and a mob that's around him. They're hopelessly outnumbered, but he fights. He's willing to fight. But I think it all unravels for Peter when Jesus just simply gives up, seemingly, and hands himself over. But clearly, Peter is still brave, because he doesn't run away into the cover of night. He follows Jesus into the very courtyard of the high priest, no less. You have to give him some credit for his bravery. But what's interesting is that we're told that the other disciple, this good friend of Peter's, is known to the high priest and obviously to the servants who are attending the gate, and that's why he's allowed in. And he gets Peter in too. And that's why the servant girl says to him, probably and obviously because she knows that John is a disciple of Jesus, she says to Peter, "Are you a disciple of Jesus too?" Notice the two, because she knows that the other one. And even though he's with another disciple, he can't speak up for Jesus. He denies it. He lies. He cracks under the interrogation of a servant girl, mind you. Not exactly an intimidating personality. Meanwhile, we switched back to Jesus inside. In verse 19, being questioned, notice, about his disciples and his teaching. I mean, they probably want to know whether he's gathering together a whole army and going to lead an insurrection. But notice that Peter is outside being questioned about Jesus by a servant girl, and he kind of throws Jesus under the bus. But Jesus is inside being questioned about Peter by the high priest, and he stands up and he continues to protect not only Peter, but all his disciples. They also questioned Jesus about his teaching, and right throughout John's Gospel, Jesus has been very public, very clear, making bold claims about who he is and what he is offering everyone. They heard him. They argued with him, but they particularly plotted to kill him because they heard his bold claims. They heard his teaching. And it's not like they've suddenly discovered a secret conspiracy that Jesus had somehow some secret teaching and a plan to take over the Romans and plot to take over the Jewish leadership. No, they planned to kill him not because of some secret conspiracy they discovered, but clearly because of his bold claims, of his open public teaching. And so Jesus tells them, well, ask around. Pull out your witnesses if you can. Remember, the law requires you to have 2 or 3 witnesses, and they're the ones you're meant to be questioning, not me. This is just a sham trial, and Jesus is exposing it by his questions. And so, rather than submit to that, they slap him in the face for his seeming insolence. But he's not being insolent, he's just being truthful. He's exposing their hypocrisy. He's exposing their guilt, and he's really putting them on trial. And ironically, in the end, God, sadly, judges them anyway. They're doing everything like this. They're sacrificing Jesus in order to save the temple and the nation. And what should take place only a few years later? But the Romans actually do come in, destroy the temple, and destroy the nation. Well, Jesus is being interrogated, and they're trying to intimidate him into submission, but he is standing strong, denying nothing. And meanwhile, we switch back to Peter, because John really wants us to see the contrast between Jesus and Peter. And here we see him striking out again and again. He keeps on denying everything. And then we hear the cock crow, just as Jesus said it would. And we know, he knows, he's failed. And the words of Jesus have been fulfilled. Now, interestingly, John doesn't tell us what goes on to happen to Peter, that he really started to weep and lament his denial of Jesus. But this is just to remind us that Jesus' words have come true, that things are panning out just as Jesus said they would. Jesus is in control. And I don't think John is kind of just sticking the knife into Peter here and deliberately putting the spotlight on him so that we can dump on Peter. He's doing it because Peter really does represent the best of the disciples, the bravest of the disciples. He goes on the public record as saying, I'm prepared to die for you, Jesus. And he's always kind of out front leading all the other disciples. He is kind of the best of the disciples. And if Peter is the best and he fails, well, what hope do the rest of us have? I mean, none of the other disciples stuck up for Jesus. They've all scattered. And John, at least, is in the outside like Peter is, but that's as good as it gets. The spotlight here is just on Peter, but it could have been on any one of the disciples. And this is kind of written, I think, for our benefits, because if you're a follower of Jesus, then you're thinking, I wouldn't want the spotlight to be on me either. How many times have I been asked about Jesus and I wasn't totally upfront and I didn't really stand up for Jesus either? What did you do on the weekend? You want to say, oh, I went to church, it was great. But you say, oh, not much. I remember being at a dinner party. The guys to my right started to talk about Christians and making jokes about Christians and laughing about Christians, and it got worse, grew to the whole table, so that the whole table was now listening to these jokes. My friend across from me looked at me directly in the eye because he knew that I was a Christian. And I felt everything in me saying I should say something. And as I was trying to say, I should say something, my mouth just wouldn't move, and I said nothing. And I got up and just walked out with red in the face, ashamed of myself, feeling just like Peter probably would have. This isn't written so that we can dump on Peter. This is written to encourage us weak, not so great followers of Jesus, for us who never live up even to our own standards, our own words, that what we will do and we don't do it, let alone God's perfect standards. Jesus is inside sticking up for Peter, and he's standing up for us too, just like he was praying for his disciples and praying for us too. Jesus is going to die for Peter, knowing what he is like, and he's going to die for us, knowing what we are like. He doesn't expect us to be perfect. He dies for us, knowing that we are imperfect, flawed sinners, flawed disciples, just like Peter. Next, the Jewish leaders take Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor. Their intention is pretty clear. They want Jesus dead, but they don't want to look bad in the process. They want to remain ceremonially clean so that they can eat the Passover meal, fulfill their religious duties, do all to honour God, so to speak. But they have no problem in, while they're seeking to fulfill that law, they have no problem in breaking one of the Ten Commandments. I was trying to work out which one it was. You know, thou shalt not bear false witness against someone. No problem in that. And thou shalt not kill. And yet they have no problem in breaking that. They can't even trump up a reasonable charge against Jesus when Pilate asks him, what charge are you bringing against him? They kind of say in verse 30, well, you should just believe us. We think he's worthy of death, just believe us. They don't have the power to put people to death, so they want Pilate to do his dirty work for them so that he can get himself in trouble and so they don't have to wear the blame for themselves. But in chapter 20, the next chapter, Jesus makes it very clear to Pilate that the ones who handed him over to him, to Pilate that is, are guilty of a greater sin than he is. Well, lastly, Jesus stands on trial before Pilate, and as we read, we realise ultimately that Pilate is being put on trial by Jesus. Because Pilate asked Jesus in verse 33, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And if you hadn't worked it out by now, that's clearly what the issue is for whether he will live or whether he will die. It's all about who Jesus is. That's the accusation that's being brought against him. It's about his identity. The Jewish leaders had been denying all along that Jesus is the Messiah, but ironically, the only thing they can bring to the Roman governor is that Jesus is the King of the Jews, an alternate king to Caesar. And all the way through the gospel, the people have been asking whether or not Jesus is the Messiah, the King of the Jews. But here is Pilate asking Jesus directly, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And we'll find out next week what he actually determines. But Jesus turns the question back on him and he says to him, "Are you coming up with this, or did someone else lead you into this?" But Pilate makes the point, what's it matter to me? I'm not a Jew. Why would I care if you're their king? Other than the political question. But Pilate keeps on trying to wriggle out of making a decision about Jesus. But what we see here is that Jesus won't let him off the hook, and neither will the people let him off the hook. So Jesus kind of says to him, my kingdom is is not a national kingdom. My kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my followers would fight. And they're not just Jews. In my kingdom, it doesn't matter your nationality. It doesn't matter your background. Jesus' kingdom is for everybody. And then Jesus forces the issue back on Pilate. It's all about the truth, verse 37. If you're on the side of the truth, then you would listen to me and be on my side. But again, verse 38, Pilate tries to be dismissive with that famous line, "What is truth?" That seems to resonate in our culture these days as well. He doesn't wait for an answer though, does he? It's just a question he throws up to muddy the waters, and then he walks away. Because Pilate doesn't want to make a decision about Jesus. But in the end, Jesus and the people won't let him off the hook. He tries to dodge judging him by asking the people to choose between Jesus and Barabbas, and he kind of gives his verdict in the process. I don't find him guilty of anything, but rather than make a decision, I'll leave you to decide. And he's doing this because he thinks this decision is going to be a no-brainer. Who shall I release? Jesus, the King of the Jews, this innocent man, or Barabbas, this guy who's gone around killing people? And he thinks it's obvious who they're going to choose, because you don't want a murderer out on the loose. But they surprise him by choosing the murderer, the guilty one. And Jesus, the innocent one, is condemned to death. Now, why is all this happening? Because clearly Pilate's not in control. Jesus is in control. It's not Pilate's will and desires that's being fulfilled, but Jesus's. And so Pilate is forced to make the decision, and he chooses political expediency over the truth. Friend, lots of people try to dodge making a decision about Jesus, but let me tell you, ultimately, inevitably, you can't, because Jesus won't allow you, and people often won't allow you. They will keep on hounding you until you say what they want to hear, or you are determined to say what you think. The question is whether you'll listen to the truth or not, whether you'll check out the evidence or not, or whether you'll keep dodging it for the sake of your own benefit. Jesus has total control over all of the situations. I hope you can see that throughout. And in these events, he is calling the shots, because all this, notice verse 32, it says, even the kind of death he's going to die. Verse 32, all this took place to fulfill what Jesus said about the kind of death he was going to die. Jesus is in total control of every detail of this story. It's no tragic death. He didn't die as a martyr whose enemies overcame him, but he was in total control all the way. This is purposeful, intentional, orchestrated events by him. The timing, the manner, the method of his death is all according to his plan. And what also comes out very clearly in this story is that Jesus is dying as an innocent person. All the way down, and we finally come to Pilate's decision. I find no basis at all for a charge against him. He is innocent. And clearly he is not dying for anything he has done wrong. His death is that of an innocent person going to the cross, or going to die as a sacrifice out of love to save his people. Because this story really is ultimately pointing to a bigger, higher trial that is taking place in the heavenly courts. In the heavenly courts, really, it's the whole world that's being put on trial as Jesus is being put on trial. But instead of Jesus dying for his sin, because clearly he's innocent, he's actually dying for the sins of the whole world. He is drinking the Father's cup, the anger that he should rightly pour out on the sins of the world. But Jesus, the innocent one, is drinking it down to the dregs. He cops the punishment for us. And in verses 38 to 40, most Christians kind of look at that story and they go, Barabbas, that's me. I'm the guilty one, just like Barabbas. And instead of God choosing me to die, he chooses Jesus to die, and Jesus willingly goes to my death instead of me. The Christian recognises that when they see Jesus on the cross, that should have been them, should have been me. But thank God it's not me, it's Jesus. Jesus' trial is actually all of our trials, because all of us have to make a decision. Now, some of us are going to be like the Jewish leaders. We're going to dismiss Jesus being the one he claims to be, the Son of the living God, the God's promised King who will rule the world forever. Some of us are like Pilate, partly curious, but ultimately we just don't want to make a decision about him. But the truth is there. And it's not an easy truth to swallow, because it's one that has to admit that you are a sinner, that you are guilty before God, that you do deserve to die. But it's a truth that accepts that Jesus died instead of me as a substitute so that I can be forgiven. Ultimately, you can be like Peter. You can have Jesus die for you, even though you're flawed, you're weak, and you can be like Barabbas, even though you're guilty. Jesus knows that, but he loves you and he dies for you anyway. What will you decide about Jesus? Amen.
Thanks for listening to today's talk. The Evangelical Union, or EU, is a student club on campus at Sydney University that seeks to proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord. To join us or to find out more, please visit sydneyunieu.org.